Thanks for coming to talk. We're going to talk about Backstage, obviously. The focus, though, today is going to be on how commercial and open source software work together at Spotify. We'll be focusing a lot on the open source plugin ecosystem as part of the open source part of Backstage. And if you're new to Backstage and want to dive a little bit more into kind of the core parts of that as well, we'll cover a little bit of that. If some of you were at Helen's talk earlier, this will kind of dovetail nicely, talk a little bit about the catalog, which we didn't cover as much there, and go a little bit more into technical details as well. And if you're just also interested in hearing me say the words plugin like 300 times, you're also in the right place, I guess, if you were here for that for some reason. But also, let's get started with a little bit about me. As I was introduced, my name's Joon. I'm an engineering manager working on Backstage at Spotify. My background is full stack web, but my heart is always going to be on the front end. With my React background, obviously, that's was my bread and butter. I'm currently based in London. I lead the team that owns Spotify plugins for Backstage. And this is Pemberley. She is not a co-presenter, don't worry, there will not be a dog rushing the stage at any moment, but she is the love of my life. I think my fiance would strongly disagree with that statement, but she's not gonna be watching this recording, so we're gonna be okay. But I'm sure you're wondering, like, why am I sharing all this? There is a reason she is featured here. We'll come back to that. It'll be relevant in just a second. But before that, what are we gonna talk about today in detail? So we'll start with a little bit about what is Backstage. For those of you who attended Helen's talk, some of this will be a little bit repeated, but again, we'll go into some little differences in detail as well. While we're on that, has anybody, well, I guess before that, who's heard of Backstage before this conference? Show of hands. Okay. And anybody using it at their company in production? Maybe a few hands? Okay, that's awesome. That's really great. So hopefully we can cover, for those of you who have not heard about it before, a good amount of the overview there. And then we'll dive into the plugin ecosystem. This is really like the heart of how Backstage is brought together, both inside Spotify as well as outside. This will be kind of the theme of how commercial and open source software go together through the way of the plugin ecosystem. Good example about this will be Spotify plugins for Backstage. This is our commercial bundle that we've launched within Spotify last December. And then we'll talk about a specific example within the Spotify plugins for Backstage and how we developed Authorization. And then we'll wrap it all up with some ways that we set ourselves up for success within Spotify and some learnings that we have about all of that. Okay, so back to the dog. For those of you who love dogs, admittedly, I think this is a really cute picture. This is the picture that we all share. Like when we get asked, like, "Oh, what does your dog look like?" It's actually my watch background. By the way, pro tip, if you're a dog owner, set your phone or watch background to your dog, because people will come up to you and be like, "Oh, tell us about your dog. We'd love to see." And then you have to do the whole thing. You take out your phone, you scroll for an awkward 30 seconds of silence while looking for your dog. Don't do that. Put it as your background. Super useful. But anyway, if you are, let's say, a dog sitter, and you're trying to take care of our dog, this is the picture we're going to show you to kind of sell our dog, right? But in reality, she doesn't look like that. She looks like that. This is the dog that we see every day. Imagine if we sent this slide to dog sitters, they'd probably email back saying we don't take care of goblins. Sorry. But of course, I love her to death. This aside, she has a big underbite, but of course, we love her to death. And the point I'm trying to make here is that this is usually the state of developer tooling at a typical company, right? This is kind of what you feel like as a developer, maybe when you come to work every day, all the tools, all the complexity, the fragmentation, the ugly bits, that you have to kind of deal with and go, ugh, the parts that you don't want to have to, right? But what if I told you that you have the opportunity to present your developers with this version of the dog, right? Like that is what Backstage can do for your organization, right? We talk about this concept of a single pane of glass, right? Just one picture. That's all they need to worry about. Gets rid of all that complexity, the fragmentation, no noise, right? So developers can really focus on what they need to do, their day-to-day work, and dog sitters can also focus on whatever dog sitters do, I guess. You might have heard of them as IDPs, internal developer portals, and Backstage, as we say, is an open platform for building one. And by open, we mean open source. So if you go to backstage.io right now and you are interested in standing one up for yourself, you could do that as soon as you wanted to. But Backstage didn't begin its life as an open source project. It was born of Spotify engineers trying to keep track of all the complexity and their various services way back in the day. And they started with a Google Sheet, and of course that's not going to scale. So they realized they were outgrowing any existing tools. So they built something called System Z, and this is of course way before my own time at Spotify. And so this was kind of like the first iteration of their solution to that problem, right? And then eventually kind of evolved and evolved and evolved more. It went through a name change to Backstage, and then it kind of amalgamated all these internal learnings from Spotify, of developers kind of trying and failing and learning of how to do developer productivity the right way, right? And eventually we open sourced it and donated it to CNCF in 2020. And I guess those learnings really hit a nerve in the industry because it really took off. The pace of adoption growth as we've open sourced it has been just absolutely incredible. So really, really cool to see that in the industry. I won't dwell on these numbers for too long, but I do think it's important to underscore the success of Backstage in open source already. I think even just 5 years ago, like IDP wasn't really an acronym that was thrown around that much. It was kind of really hard to explain to organizations why you needed something like that. And now, like, everybody and their aunt or dog sitter thinks their platform engineering is the topic to talk about in the industry, right? I mean, it is, and I think it's a good reason. And we can see hopefully throughout this talk as well what Backstage actually does for developers. Okay, so the concrete metaphor for your developers, if you're in Helen's talk, you've seen this. This is the problem that we're trying to solve, right? Like if you are a developer, you go to work, you see something like this, and instead, we want to give you the option of using Backstage and just your code, right? A lot of the things that we address, you'll kind of hear words throughout this talk come back to that I'll come back to. Things like fragmentation. These are concepts that we really think we've targeted through our solution. And so, idea of the solution here: just your code and Backstage. Okay, so how do we actually do that? How does Backstage work? Well, these are kind of the 3 core concepts that we like to talk about. So speed, standards, and ecosystem. So going back to the idea of fragmentation, if you solve that fragmentation, developers can get things done more quickly. This means faster onboarding, faster bootstrapping of new services, faster access to documentation, APIs, faster finding things, right? We'll show you in just a second how our 3 core plugins really make all this possible. And standardization, I really like the phrase standards set you free. I really do think it's true, especially at Spotify. I think software templates is a really good example of that. Liz mentioned in her talk, like making the right thing, the fast thing, and also the easy thing to do. And this is kind of our way of implementing that. And then finally, in order for a developer portal to be successful, it needs a good ecosystem. And you'll notice before how I said core plugins, not necessarily core features. I'll probably say core features again in the talk, but the point is like they're the same thing, right? Like these features are plugins. Backstage is designed around this plugin ecosystem, and that's what makes it really powerful and customizable for every organization and their needs. This is a point that we'll come back to over and over again, so keep that in your back pocket. The plugins specifically, I mean, of course, you can build it in your own organization to meet your specific needs. Spotify has done that for hundreds of plugins. Um, but also, you can leverage the ones that already exist. The open source community has built a ton of really great plugins. This is what makes the community so awesome and what makes Backstage so powerful already, even if you haven't invested a ton of time maybe into your organization's specific needs, because all of the typical tooling that you would expect, Jenkins, GitHub, Sentry, PagerDuty, I mean, like they're all there, right? You can go browse them, pick the ones that you need and use them in your organization. So you don't need to create plugins from scratch to start benefiting from Backstage. Okay, so back to those core plugins that I mentioned. What are these? Well, here they are. And here are the problems that they solve. So software templates, this is our key solution to move organizations away from fragmentation and towards standardizations. Again, if you watch Helen's talk, you probably got a good demo of how this actually works. So we won't be covering too much in detail of software templates today. But again, like going back to that concept of making the right thing the easy thing to do. Tech docs, this is our documentation solution. As mentioned before, again, we put the documentation where the code lives, where the developers want to be in the code, right? And if you look at it from the perspective of someone consuming that documentation, it really solves a very, very critical question in someone's day-to-day workflow, which is, where do I go to find X, right? And you would be surprised the monumental gains to your mental model and flow when you just completely eliminate that question from your day, right? Like no longer does a developer have to ask, like, where do I go to find this information? They just go to Backstage. You just search, you find it under some service catalog. I mean, you go to Backstage and that's where it is, right? So it's really a big difference to have documentation all inside and cataloged in Backstage. And of course, the software catalog. This is the meat of what we're going to be diving into here. We'll get back to that in just a second. And we also have search, but I mean, it's search. That's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so the software catalog. This is what it looks like. You can see how this puts all of your company's components in one place, front and center. Like most of the other Backstage plugins, you can find it there on the left on the sidebar. And you can see that here, you've got various services, different columns of information. And we've got a demo that is actually going to walk you through some of these features. I will say the catalog demo that you will see is the information is a bit contrived, but it should still give you a good sense of the value that catalog can provide. So here's the catalog. We're going to filter into the API components. You're going to click into one. You can see what the entity page really looks like. You can see the consumers of that API listed there on the bottom. And here's the actual documentation for, the information, the details about the API and the endpoints. Here's the documentation about the API component, all co-located in one place. If you wanted, you could filter by production components only. That's something you could do. You can click into, so this is a website, and then you can see that it actually consumes the previous API component that we saw. Here's some CI/CD information for this website. You can see the build information, some logs. And again, a lot of this, you have already available at your fingertips. This is not the Spotify specific version. This is all available open source. And then same again, the documentation. All right. So how does all that work? All the features that you saw, the information that was populated there, like where does all that come from? The answer is actually really simple. We keep the software catalog information in a definition YAML file. And that YAML file lives right inside your source code. Like was mentioned before, like we want to keep all that information in Git. where you can iterate on it, and again, close to the code where the developer is going to be using it, right? Here's what a typical YAML file looks like for the catalog. This is, a small truncated version, but you can kind of start to get an idea. You have your kind, which is a component, spec.type, you can see as a service. You can see lifecycle, owner. The links here are interesting. This one tells you that this service actually provides the pet store API. And so this is the source of truth that the catalog kind of ingests and is able to use to collate all that information. So all you have to do now is just go and manually write, a few hundred YAML files that you have for all your services at your company, right? No, that's terrible. Please don't do that. This is screaming for some automation. And thankfully, you don't have to contend with the realities of automation as depicted here, because we've already done that for you. Software templates is the solution to that problem. Again, if you were at Helen's talk before, you've seen how some of this works. And if you create a piece of software through the software catalog, you don't have to write it yourself. It just gets created right alongside all the other code that's bootstrapped for you. Okay, now you can say easy peasy. Here's a sneak peek. Oh yeah, this is what the internal software creation page looks like. This is what we use day to day. I know the differences are kind of mostly visual, but we also do get the question a lot from community saying like, what does the Spotify one look like? How's it different? So just to give you a little taste of what we use every day. One good question that you might be thinking at this point is like, what if we're just onboarding onto Backstage? Like we have tons of services already. We have software that might not already be cataloged in Backstage. Well, what do we do then? In that case, you will have to manually write hundreds of YAML. No, wouldn't that be crazy? Can you imagine if that was true? No, just use that little register existing component button there. Don't sweat it. That'll take care of all your existing services for you. Okay, so now you've ingested all your existing services. You've maybe created some new ones using your software catalog. Okay, now what? You are the proud new owner of a few hundred existing entities in your catalog. Entities are what we call the core components of the software catalog, the core unit rather. The three most important type of which are components, APIs, and resources. So components are the things that you would typically expect, things that we've already been talking about that you would find in a software catalog. So backend services, websites, data pipelines, things like that. APIs help you describe the connection between those in a way that Backstage can not only understand, but also visualize for you, which is really useful. I think you got a glimpse of that in the video demo there. And then resources are, of course, the infrastructure that you need to run those components. So S3 buckets, databases, things like that. We also have organizational entities, which consists of users and groups. With these, you can start to represent the structure of your organization, organizational hierarchies, things like that. There are entities that also help us describe larger software ecosystems. So this is now getting into the point of larger companies that have domains, or we call them systems as well. And so with all these different types of entities, you can kind of start to get the idea of how one would combine all this information inside a software catalog to give you a really robust representation of the stuff that you own, the software that is really being worked on at your company. Concepts like ownership of components, different API layers and how they're used, the relationship between these various pieces of software. I mean, this is really the value that you get by using Backstage. Okay, so let's jump to this whole plugin ecosystem thing, because I know we've mentioned this a lot previously. I keep saying like, oh, core features are plugins, and previously I mentioned that all of the useful functionality of Backstage is also in the form of plugins. So it would be right of you to ask, is everything in Backstage just a plugin? Well, yeah, actually, that's kind of the right answer. We can dig into what a plugin actually is, and in the very, very simplest sense, it's really just an NPM package. These plugins, they're like any other package that you would really expect to find. Just some TypeScript or JavaScript you bundle together, you put it on npm. If you go to npmjs.org, you search at Backstage, you can take a look at some of these examples yourself if you're interested. And these packages are almost always divided into these conventions. Usually front end and back end is the most important. We have some shared packages, but again, they're just convention. The shared one's not so important. We're not going to go too much into that today. So starting with the front end side of things, the front end plugin is usually, and really you can think of it as just a React app, right? It's truly just that simple. You can imagine how this allows Backstage plugins to be incredibly powerful in terms of the features that they offer, because you can build whatever you can build in a React web app, you can build as a Backstage plugin. And that's really great. And backend, same thing. It's actually just a Node and Express service. You can put all the different kind of endpoint service functionality that you would really need to make your Backstage feature work inside the backend plugin. But I did mention it is a plugin, not actually a standalone app. So you do get some things for free. In the front end, you don't have to worry about things like the core UI. So navigation is given to you. It just plugs into the Backstage navigation. How to consume APIs from other plugins, that's something that's provided for you. You don't have to worry about. In the back end, you don't have to set up database access. You can just plug right into the database that's already set up in the adopter's Backstage instance. There's a SQL connection layer for that. So a lot of room to play with and a little bit of infrastructure and tooling to help you out. We can dive into some concrete examples here. This is as simple as they come. You can find this one on open source as a TechRadar plugin. You've probably all seen TechRadars at this point to some extent, but if you have such a plugin in your organization, you can standardize what your organization's opinions are for certain technologies, and it's really just a static front end. The architecture is super simple. And of course, you can build a backend plugin to go with some front-end functionality as well. This is probably the most common architecture for Backstage plugin. And I say architecture, I know there's like four circles and squares on the board, but I think the simplicity does speak volumes. If you need to talk to external services, you can do that too. We provide a proxy inside the Backstage platform. So you can use that to query third-party services, like Circle CI plugin is a good example of this in the open source. Okay, let's do a little bit of recap. We talked about Backstage at a high level, where we came from, what problems it solves. We dove into the software catalog. We took a look at how it helps you centralize all your components in a single place through the concept of entities. And then we saw how every feature in Backstage is really just a plugin, including the catalog, and how the simple architecture of these plugins really allowed you to build some really powerful features for your developers. Okay, storytelling time. So put yourself back 2 years or so, 2021, I guess. We've open source Backstage. It's exploding in popularity. There's a lot of buzz about it in the open source community. And Spotify realized, we still have a ton of untapped potential, like developer productivity knowledge inside the company that, we'd really like to still, bring to the world. And the idea of commercial software came up. And when you think about commercializing on top of an open source ecosystem, there's traditionally a few business models or kind of ways you could go about it. I think SaaS is one that most people probably think about first. You have an open source product, you provide hosting, or you get some other nice stuff around it. Maybe if you like purchase the SaaS product, I think MongoDB used to be like this. Maybe they still are. Obviously, professional services is another model you could follow. You could offer, support, enterprise level, things like that. Red Hat, I think, is a good example of that. And then there's also this one that's kind of like loosely defined called open core. People throw around that term a lot for a lot of different things. And, this concept of open source core offering and then like things you can plug in to to the side that you can kind of like pay for. And really, the plugin ecosystem can be seen as a variation of that. One of the biggest strengths of this is obviously the fact that the incentives align, right? The growth and prosperity of the open source community is aligned with whatever commercial offering that you're putting on top of it. Of course, in our case, without open source Backstage, there's no plugin ecosystem. And without plugin ecosystem, we don't have commercial plugins, right? There are some differences though. Plugin ecosystem means that we don't monopolize any functionality. So anyone can build plugins, as I mentioned, out in the community. A good example is like we offer an authorization solution within the commercial bundle that we're about to talk about. But of course, anybody can go and build their own authorization solution on top of Backstage as a plugin. You can take that one step further and we could say that it really creates a level playing field. Spotify doesn't hold the secret to plugin creation under lock and key, right? We write plugins the same way everybody else writes plugins. So given all this, we knew that creating a plugin bundle as our very first commercial product was the way to go. And of course, as I mentioned, we had years and years of valuable developer productivity expertise within Spotify in the form of, you guessed it, plugins. So thus was born Spotify plugins for Backstage. So this bundle is structured around this idea that developer effectiveness is a function of developers' productivity and their happiness, right? So the first two plugins are kind of aimed at more of this productivity side, and the last three plugins are aimed a little bit more at this happiness side. But these bundle plugins all kind of work together around this idea of developer effectiveness. Some short descriptions of each of these. So RBAC is our authorization solution that I mentioned before. Soundcheck makes it really easy to visualize some important standards for your software. So things like security, testing, other tech health metrics like reliability. You can use Soundcheck to really make it easy for your developers to own those metrics for their own services, and even small features that point towards like gamification and things like that. Skill Exchange, if you're at Helen's talk, you already know about Skill Exchange. It's an internal marketplace for development opportunities and provides a place for developers to learn from one another using hacks, mentorships, embeds, things like that. Pulse lets you run surveys that are specifically targeted towards developer satisfaction. So to give you an idea of how your developers are doing at an organizational level. And Insights gives you a ton of really great metrics on how developers are actually using your Backstage instance. This one specifically is really great for those organizations who might be interested in adopting Backstage and are really in the early stage or maybe kind of early mid stage, and they're having trouble pushing it out to the broad reaches of your organization, and you really need some kind of insight onto how you can push adoption a little bit further. Insights can really help you do that. So you might already be able to see how some of these plugins do rely heavily on the open source plugin features that we talked about before. So Soundcheck, for example, it pulls a lot of the information about your software components from the software catalog. Skill Exchange puts user entities that we talked about before front and center, add some really great new attributes to those like skill tags, and that shows up on your Backstage user profile. Insights, of course, wouldn't be possible without the analytics tooling that is in the open source. And of course, the best example of this is our RBAC plugin. So a few years ago, authorization within Backstage was maybe the single most requested feature in the community. And interestingly enough, this is actually not a problem that we needed to solve within Spotify. We have a very, very open R&D culture. We don't really, have a need to like authorize access to things, especially within Backstage. So this is not something that in our own Backstage instance we'd really needed to think about. But we knew that this is something that we needed to solve because the community, had a lot of varieties of needs, and this was hotly requested. So how do we do that? Well, this is a really big problem space. So let's kind of constrain our problem, right? So the problem statement goes like this. We want to provide Backstage administrators a way to configure user access to entities and features within Backstage. So as we explored this problem, we realized something pretty important, which is that different organizations have a very wide variety of access control needs. Their business needs are of course different, but and that results in a really wide gamut of different authorization needs. So coming up with a solution that was flexible enough for a variety of needs was very important. We also realized that these varying business needs are going to be reflected by a similarly varied preference in authorization formats, mechanisms rather. So role-based or attribute-based, or there are different needs like that. It became pretty clear that this new authorization surface across Backstage needed to live squarely in the open source first. So after all, as I mentioned before, all of the useful features in Backstage are spread across all sorts of different plugins, right? So if we want a solution that can really deliver authorization across all these plugins, of course, the solution needed to be integrated with the plugin architecture. So once we knew that, it was pretty clear where to start. We wanted to start with the software catalog. Like we said before, core plugins are just features. And so if we could build a framework that works with the catalog, we knew it would also work with all of the other plugins out there, including the ones that different adopters had already built for custom needs inside their own organizations. So we put out a PRFC for the open source permission framework. This is what it looked like. This permission framework truly delivered that authorization surface with two major solution areas. So one, plugin authors could now make various actions and resources within their plugins available for authorization. And two, Backstage adopters could use those definitions to craft policies that would reflect their organization's business needs. So these are kind of the two main use cases of the permission framework, and that's what we've delivered. The main concepts underlying the permission framework, it's pretty straightforward. So to represent those user actions that need to be authorized, we created the permission object. And as you can see, it is very simple. You can kind of start to think of some examples, going back to the catalog, like catalog entity read is an action, accessing catalog entity and getting information back. Catalog entity delete, unregistering entities from the catalog, that's an action. And they're represented using these permission objects. And some of these permission objects act on resources. So unsurprisingly, we call those resource permissions. The catalog entity delete permission that I mentioned before is a resource permission, and it's acting on the resource of catalog entity. But you can probably imagine, it's not just the catalog, right? As I mentioned before, we need this to be extensible over all different types of plugins and all different types of resources. And of course, different plugins that we don't know about and various adopters, own customizable Backstage instances. So, you can start to think about how this is applicable in other cases, like soundcheck, for example. You can permission tracks and checks. Those are two types of resources within soundcheck. This extensibility, I think, really not only works for the plugin developers, but also works for the Backstage adopters who install those plugins into their Backstage instance, because then now they have access to authorize all of those things. And this is what I think is actually the key architectural decision of the permission framework. This handle function is how we ask policy authors to define their authorization policies. And as you can see, it's about as open-ended as you can possibly get. It's literally just an async function. You can do anything you want inside it. I mean, you can, call external sources of truth, arbitrary logic, obviously. I mean, network calls, like whatever you need to make that decision. And all you need to do at the end is just return a policy decision. So this super, super extensible design, I think, really meets the needs of those various adopters. We want this to be compatible with anything. And on top of this very, very flexible architecture was the perfect opportunity for us to offer one specific authorization solution that a lot of people had been asking for, which is, of course, role-based access. So this is what the RBAC plugin looks like. This is part of our commercial bundle, and this front end that we've built, we actually optimize it for ease of use, not only for Backstage adopters, typical integrators per se, but also administrators who might not have knowledge to code. And you can see that all the information about policies, authorization, is displayed to you in a way that obviously works without needing to write lines of code. You can go into roles, you can craft roles that reflect your organization, you can author permission decisions for plugins that you have installed within your Backstage instance. So if any of the plugins that you have installed in Backstage already are integrated into the permission framework, you'll see and be able to use it in your permission decisions. You can even author conditional decisions that will allow or deny a request based on some arbitrarily complex set of criteria. This criteria are called permission rules, and any plugin that has resources can define rules. Right? So you can see some examples for the catalog here that you can match on. Super customizable, and all this works beautifully with the plugins integrated with the permission framework. So this dual model, going back to this idea of working within this space harmoniously, right? The RBAC plugin being built on top of this open source permission framework has really proven to be a great architectural decision for us. It's actually worked so well. In fact, we're going to employ the same model for a feature we're building called Quick Start. And you may have seen, if you are plugged in with the open source Backstage community, a feature called declarative integration. And that PRFC has been out for a while. And if you're following closely, we think Quick Start is going to be a really interesting and exciting new feature to build on top of that feature. So tune into our Backstage webinar on October 12th if you want to learn more. Okay, so I know, at this point, the word plugin is probably starting to lose its meaning for some of you. So we're going to take a 15-second break. I'm going to let you read this comic. And this is actually my segue into AI of this talk, because it's 2023 and every talk needs to be about AI. No, I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. In fact, we're going to talk about exactly the opposite of AI. We're going to talk about the human side of things. So how did we do all this at Spotify? There are, the obvious one that probably comes to mind is to separate concerns, right? Open source maintainers on one team, commercial bundle owned by another team, and so on. Of course, this does have advantages when you want to allow teams to execute independently, but we found that it doesn't really give us the space to think holistically across all of Backstage. To give you a specific example, the open source maintainers used to own the TechDocs plugin, and we had a different team that owned the TechDocs plugin for the internal Spotify Backstage instance. And so the execution was there, it was quick, but there was a lack of cohesion, so we were duplicating work. So we realized it would be much more efficient for a single team to own one version of the tech docs across both surfaces. And so we pushed for a single team to unify the tech docs experience and own it holistically. And this allowed us to plan more cohesively, naturally align our incentives with the community even better. And if we go back to RBAC, it's the same way with the permission framework and the commercial plugin, right? One team owns both. So that team's way of working can encourage them to consider benefits for both open source and commercial when conceptualizing any feature and really think critically about, where should it land. Now, some of you may ask, you said there were hundreds of plugins within Spotify. How do you maintain all those? Well, we actually don't. I don't mean that like we have hundreds of unmaintained plugins just like racking up security vulnerabilities. It's as in like the Backstage maintainers, not the developers at Spotify. The Backstage product area owns a very small subset of plugins within our Backstage instance. The vast majority of these plugins were owned by other engineering teams all across the org. And this way, we can take full advantage of the plugin ecosystem architecture even within our own org structure. We can rely on these teams to do what they do best and maintain their own plugins. And of course, some of which has been externalized now through Backstage plugins for Spotify. All right, so what have we learned throughout all of this? Well, I think I will say the specific idea of externalizing software is a very difficult one, and that's not something I'll dive too much into right now. I think you could do a whole talk on just that. I mean, I think people have done whole talks on that, but we'll focus on a few other quick points. So, keeping up with the rapid community growth is hard. Of course, we're thrilled to see this growth. People are adopting Backstage. That's really cool to see that we've kind of delivered something that really solves a problem that exists for many companies. But there are still hurdles that we know adopters are facing, like quick and easy adoption to Backstage, and these are things that we are, of course, working to address. The flexibility of the plugin ecosystem is amazing, but maybe onboarding onto making some of these plugins could be a little bit better. We talked about the power that you have as a developer when you're making a plugin. You have all of anything really like that you can put in a full stack web app available to you, which is great. But sometimes that makes it a little bit kind of like decision paralysis when you're trying to write a Backstage plugin, and you're thinking about where do I start? What's the best way to do X, Y, Z? So we're also hoping to improve that and provide more resources. And it takes a conscious effort, but it is possible for teams to execute in a way that aligns incentives. Of all the things, I think this is the one that we're still continuously working on the most. Within our Spotify teams, we're still, just like that TechDocs example, there's more that we're trying to do to push towards that unified model, but we really think the benefits are worth it when you put in the effort. All right, so that brings me to the end. Thank you all for coming, and feel free to reach out and connect if you have more questions about Backstage.